Good morning. This is Kenneth and Heather with the Advancing Equity Coalition here to give you our analysis on what went down last night during the Minneapolis Committee of the Whole meeting. How are you doing today, Heather?
I'm good today. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. Excited that the district is talking about literacy. Disappointed in the way that the district's talking about literacy. Um, so let's get into it. So last night the school board had two different conversations. Well, I guess almost three different conversations. The first one was really centered around the return to in-person school and some of the um, developments and what's going on there. And then they started to have a conversation about literacy for special education students and English language learner students. And so um, we have lots of thoughts. If you caught a shorter video, you know that we're really amped about these two topics or these three topics. And so, um, Heather, let's start with you. What was your initial takeaway from what we heard during the return to in person conversation?
You know, my initial thought, there's this saying that we talk about when your kids are little, where we say the the days are long, but the years go fast, right? And I think when we think about COVID in the context of education, the days are so long. And yet, what has changed from week to week and our going back to school in person is mind boggling to me. I mean, the fact that we went from 86 vaccinations with no awareness or thought that we were ever going to get more to getting 2,500 this week. And I have teacher friends who are going to get their first vaccination Saturday. That the days are long, but the change happens so quickly. And I think there's been a lot of mistrust and a lot of talk about how the district isn't doing enough and isn't doing their part. And I have to just say, when I listen to the presentations of what our district is aware of, what we're doing for planning, how hard we're working to get kids back in school, I just like I don't find the criticisms to be valid. I think that I cannot believe what we are accomplishing in a month. I can't believe like a month ago we weren't talking about going back hardly, and look at how far we've come. It's astounding to me.
Yeah, and I think that it's right. You're right that we've heard so much, and it was centered around the concerns and fears of different groups of people who are very loud, very vocal, um, and what we are starting to see and what we are seeing is that they don't speak for families and students, right? And as much as, for example, like that Minneapolis Federation of Teachers wanted to say, no, families don't want to go back. This is just the districts saying that the families want to go back. Families of color don't want to go back. That's not what the data is showing us. And if you saw our short video, you saw that it's about half of the students who've responded want to go back, and half of the students that or families that responded want to stay in distance learning. And then there's an extra 10% who haven't responded yet that are being counted as going back to in person. But that's really significant that we don't know when that flip was for families. Let's say that first. We don't know when families started to say we want to go back to in person. It could have been, in the last 2 weeks when that started to become a more tangible option. It could have been in the last 2 months. It could have been at the start of the school year, right? That families wanted to take the risk of going back in person. We have robbed 50% of our families of what they wanted to do for this long now. And I think that is important to recognize, is that we know that families are not being served properly in distance learning. And, I think there's good people out there that are trying to say we need to figure out a better way to do distance learning to make it more equitable, to make sure that it's more effective. Um, but those are not the fights that have risen to the top, right? Like those are not the conversations that have risen to the top of the what's being discussed publicly. And I think what's also really frustrating is that we've also seen um, people say like, yeah, I know what's best, and and we're gonna fight for that vocally, and we're gonna tear down everyone in our way that doesn't agree with us. And I think again that the district took a really smart approach, and maybe we give credit to the district for doing it. Maybe they're copying what other folks are doing across the country, but
Maybe the governor said we had to go back.
right. But like, I just think that this is a harder conversation than just saying it's not safe.
Right.
And you've mentioned this before. Director Arneson has talked about like the duality of what's at stake, right? The physical health and safety of our students and our families and our teachers and our staff, and like the academic crisis that is literally in our hands, that we feel, see, and touch every day before the pandemic even started, and now it's just making it worse. And every choice that we're making right now might be to preserve the health and safety of our students and families, but our costing comes at a real significant cost academically for students who only go to third grade once, who are only 10 years old once, who are only seniors in high school one time, ninth graders in high school one time, right? And so this comes at a cost, and this comes at not just the cost of 1 year. It'll come at the cost of the health and future of our city. And I think that is something that has to weigh on the superintendent's mind, the school board's mind, district administration, building leaders, teachers, everybody's mind, is that we see regularly that we're not supporting students well. And we have to do everything that we can to make sure that we are providing a great education. And there's going to be lots of conversations, and I hope we start having serious conversations, not only about what we're going to do moving forward, but how are we going to recover from what has been lost.
Yep. And I think there are no easy decisions. And also, this is all happening inside of a system that has made really bad decisions for students of color on repeat. And so, like, giving them the choice now, I think is the right thing. I think it's the right thing. And I hope we continue to do more of that. I said that in our last video. I hope that drowning out the loudest voices, getting the data, taking the effort to call families, to ask them what they want, letting that be the decision maker, to me, like, I hope we continue to see this again and again and again, because it feels like a really big shift in the way that we typically do things. And it's a shift because lots of people are upset about it, right? And so shifting creates disruption, creates tension. And so we need this tension. We need to get comfortable with tension in our district because we are failing.
Yeah, and I think that when we talk about how families are, making the choices that they're making in terms of going back to school in person versus, staying at home, that's obviously a very important choice that everyone is getting behind. But also, I think there's a value here in what the district has done, that I think the district, like Minneapolis Public Schools and us as a city, really have to start thinking about how can we infuse this into every way that we engage with parents and families. And I think that is honoring families and students' choices, right? And then figuring out how do we facilitate the best options possible, because I think that's a really significant thing that we need to do. And so, one example that I know gets heavily criticized is the CDD. And, people will argue that the CDD has limited family choices because of, the restrictions on busing to where students can go to school and just different things like that. And I think that is something that needs to be really weighed, right? To say, like, the district cannot continue to just make decisions that says, this is what you're going to do, and these are the only ways that we're going to facilitate this type of education, right? Like, I think giving families choice and honoring that choice is important, but that also needs to be weighed, obviously, with what the district can sustainably provide. And before, in the system for the CDD, or our current system right now, the district cannot sustainably provide education in the way that we're seeing it right now. but restricting that choice and but still providing families with like magnet school choices and options like that. I think it is important to acknowledge here are the balances that we have to have. We have to have a system that that the district can sustainably provide a high quality education to all students, while also saying, families, here are the choices that you have. And so how can the district continue to provide families with engagement opportunities that really ensures that they're heard, right? And really ensures that every decision that they make, every way that they engage is meaningful to how Minneapolis will start to adapt to serve the needs of families. And I just think about 90% of families responding to the survey already is really, really powerful. And I said it in the short video, I'll say it again, like that's the energy we need to see. So how do we continue to, how do we continue to make sure that families see that they're going to be heard when the district asks them a question? And also, how do we ensure that families are heard even when the district doesn't ask them the question, but families have a concern that they want addressed, right? And I think that's what I saw in this whole process is families being given agency and families' choices being respected and facilitated in the best way possible by the district in a way that's sustainable for the district to continue to provide those services. So yeah, I don't know, that felt like a long tangent, but I hope was clear.
Yeah, and I think the other thing we can kind of shift and talk a little bit about literacy. I mean, I agree with you on all of those things. I think that we have to kind of always be holding the reality of what is inside of what is the next right decision in front of us, right? But we also had an update on literacy inside of special education and literacy inside of ESL programming last night. We have kind of a recurring theme that we've had for all of the literacy updates. This is now we've had 3 or 4 meetings where we've talked about literacy from different places. And the theme that we have is like, I now feel informed enough to probably attend a literacy meeting inside of Minneapolis Public Schools with literacy specialists and really understand the flow charts. I mean, we've sat through all of those meetings. I now know a lot about literacy. What I don't know is what we are going to do that is different in any of these ways to talk about the fact that, and what we see really fast is like, this is the number. It's horrible. Okay, now here's all the training we give adults, and we're going to spend 45 minutes on that. And so I still don't really understand what we're doing different for literacy. I really don't. But I do know that I could go to a literacy meeting, and I think that's problematic.
Yeah. I mean, I'm glad that you've been able to comprehend some of the things that we talked about literacy, because I feel like I'm just being like thrown around with buzzwords and data cycles and interventions and assessment, and I know those things are important, and I do think I've gotten a better understanding around what we're going to do and what are some of the decision trees that are made when identifying certain students, where students are at and what interventions are necessary. I just don't know what they think is broken then. Because if this is what they're doing or this is what they're implementing, right? So let's say this is what they're implementing, right? Let's start there. Let's say this is what they're implementing. What is the problem that this implementation is fixing, right? And why do we think that this is going to be effective? And what impact do we think that this strategy for MTSS, interventions, whatever, is going to have ultimately on student achievement? And what is this going to do specifically for students of color? What is this going to do specifically for ELL students? What is this going to do specifically for special education students? And we've heard time and time again concerns from folks outside of the district, right, about curriculum, philosophy, all kinds of things. And that's not a conversation that's being put on the table to talk about, you know, to really defend this curriculum, right? To defend the philosophy of the district right now on literacy. And while I appreciate the ins and outs of this specific, you know, of MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support, and, you know, all of that stuff, we don't know, I don't know, I feel like, why this curriculum, this approach to literacy has been selected, and why we think it will be successful when there's so many concerns here and also from across the country around this curriculum and this philosophy. So I get that, you know, we've invested a ton of money and then we're creating supplemental supports and, you know, resources and all that stuff, but it doesn't make sense to me why we're having conversations about these decision trees and all the different things that are happening at that level when I don't know how much of that is the argument, and what that's the concern, because the concern comes at a higher level, and maybe this approach is to like help people get bought into this approach and this curriculum, but I think my questions still remain that you're talking about this in a vacuum of, you know, what, that this isn't a crisis that we're living in, and you're presenting to a board that needs to figure out like where are we going to invest, what needs to change, but you're not presenting them with your analysis of what's wrong. And so I just don't, frankly, I'm not understanding the point of all of these conversations. What's the goal here, other than just to say like, hey, this, like, you all had concerns about literacy, now we're talking about literacy for 5 meetings in a row.
Yeah, and I think the other criticism that we've had is like we're getting kind of soft data, don't you think? I mean, I feel like so much of the conversation talks about what we're doing, and so little of the conversation talks about like how bad it is. And I think when we think specifically about English language learners, and we think about the services that they're getting, and, you know, I really appreciated, I kind of mentioned this, I really appreciate Director Caprini talking and saying like, okay, but do these kids get an opportunity to move out of these trainings? Can we show that they're learning from all of this? Can we show that we're making improvement? And we did not get that answer. So I will be watching to see if we get that data. You said it before. The two Black women on the board last night asked for data and accountability. Data and accountability. And again, that's where we fall short in literacy in our district. And so, yeah, I want to see that data. I want to see that we're giving, I mean, we know these stories. We know these stories that even in the like good, quote, I'm using air quotes, integrated, you know, schools with all the opportunity, we still know that there's schools within schools in Minneapolis, that students of color inside of like integrated schools have a different experience than the white students in that integrated school. And if this all is feeding that, then we need to like name it honestly.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, you talked a little bit about English language learners. I'll talk a little bit about special education, which is, you know, what a concern that I've heard is that, and data that I think would be important to share, is how many special education students are meeting their IEP goals, the goals set out in their IEPs, because I think that's also really important context. And I'd be interested to hear how many of them are achieving their IEP goals in literacy specifically, right? If we want to make this conversation about literacy, let's make it about literacy. I'm fine with that. I think that we need to consistently be talking about literacy, but it doesn't feel like we're talking about, even though we're talking about like literacy content, it feels like we're talking about MTSS, which is fine, but it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere, and it doesn't feel like we're working towards how we broke this, or how do we fix this system that's fundamentally broken, that produces such poor outcomes for students of color, that produces such poor outcomes for English language learner students and produces such poor outcomes for special education students. I know there is an audit a number of years ago on special education literacy, and apparently the results of that audit was your special education students can't read because your students can't read, right? And so not saying that we shouldn't focus on special education students, that we absolutely should focus on special education students, but like literacy in this district is so fundamentally broken, and MTSS can be a strategy, sure, to support them. But I think there's a broader conversation that we're ignoring because we are zoomed in on MTSS and the interventions and whatever. And I don't know why this approach to this conversation is happening in this way. And I think that's really significant. And to your point, yeah, 2 Black women on this board said we need to talk about data and we need to talk about accountability, because that is what gets us to equity. We uncover equity, or we uncover inequities when we look at the data. We start to fix some of these inequities when we start to figure out who's holding who accountable and why things are happening the way that they are, and where are the breakdowns, right? And we're not having those conversations right now, and it's very frustrating because we just continue to have what feel like nothing conversations to not solve a huge problem in our district.
I have no clue where we're going after this many meetings on literacy. I have no clue where we're going. I have no clue what our theory of change is. I have no clue what we're going to do that's different. I have no clue how we're quantifying that or justifying that. I have no clue who we're looking to for examples. I don't know where literacy is going in our district, and that concerns me because we need to go somewhere different than we are.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about this in a couple of different instances. Sometimes it feels like presentations from district administration really feel like this is what should happen in the ideal, but there's no conversation around like the reality and what happens if this breaks down. And this really feels like the district leadership just assumes everything will work perfectly the way that they say that it should work. And what we consistently hear from families, especially in right now, what we're hearing from special education families around what's going on through distance learning is my kids are not getting any services whatsoever. And so it makes it really difficult to understand, like, we're having this conversation around MTSS and whatever, but students aren't getting those services. So the bridge to those 2 places is accountability. But I will say that this district does not want to talk about accountability. And I will say that like the white privilege in this city does not want to talk about accountability. And I think that is the problem, is when we start, saying we need to hold people accountable, who are we asking to hold accountable? We're asking to hold principals accountable. We're asking to hold teachers accountable. And the second we start having conversations around how we need to hold teachers accountable or we want to hold principals accountable, suddenly it becomes, oh, it's so hard. Those poor kids, you'll never understand. I'm just wondering, great. Yeah, those kids are coming from are poor, right? And they're living in households that don't have a ton of money and maybe don't have as much support as, some of the kids in, Southwest Minneapolis or whatever. So does that mean that they are not ever going to learn and that you cannot support them in learning? Because then we need to start having a different conversation about who should be in our classrooms and who should be in our schools.
And then the conversations turn ugly.
Yeah. And that's where we get into trouble. So with that, we will leave you. Thank you for listening. And Heather, appreciate you having this conversation with me and listening to that school board meeting last night.
It was a good one. Always.
Hope you have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye.